Angeli,
Terry.
I was thinking today about, something happened to me, and what it is isn't important, but it brings me to a question that I'd like to explore, and that is, what do you do when you get good advice from somebody you really don't like?
Well, first of all, that's a very good question. As far as advice is concerned, I think everyone, whether we like it or not, everyone has something to offer. Because usually, if it's a good advice, it comes from experience. And
Yes.
one's experience teaches one many things.
And your experience will tell you how to consider that advice or how to look at that advice
Right.
rather than simply reacting to the source.
Exactly, because it's not so much that we have to judge the source, but we have to find out and discern within ourselves whether that advice is of any use to us in the situation that we are in.
Well, that makes perfect sense and is obviously clearly the way one should do that. But we also have so many shortcuts in our life. Things like, it's from that news channel. I don't want to listen to it. I don't care what they say. Or so-and-so is so committed to that particular school or philosophy or sports team that it just obviates conversation.
Right.
So when somebody who is in a negative category somehow, it's some pejorative term connected to this person, and they offer you a piece of advice or they tell you about something, it can be a sticking point for a moment.
It can be, and like you said, we live in an age where the sources are more often than not unknown. Whether
Good
it's the
point.
news, whether it's
Good
the
point.
facts, we don't really know, and to get to the source isn't a job in itself. But in the case that you mentioned, when you're getting advice from a person that you've not had a pleasurable experience with, in that case, one has to distance oneself from judging the source and see and discern for oneself if that advice is really useful or not.
Yes, and I would go further to say whether it is useful to you or not.
Exactly.
Because it may have been exactly what some other person needed at a particular time, and it may have been the golden solution to whatever problem they were facing, but it just might not apply for you. So it could be good advice.
Yes, and it could be not so good advice too. It depends on the person's situation. But I think more importantly, the advice that comes from an experience is much more powerful than an advice that comes from reading a book.
I agree with you completely. There's so many times when it's so easy for people to just quote text that they've read as if it were really an understanding.
Yes.
And I've often wondered how difficult it can be to decide whether somebody really, really, really understands what they're talking about, or whether they can just answer a lot of questions about it. They're two very different things.
And that's a good way to measure the advice on.
Yes, I suppose
Yes.
that's right. Thank you. Right.
Thank you, Terry.